for bringing women into the Afghan National Security Forces. Who's in charge of it? Is it the Afghan government? Is it a partnership? Who's in charge of it? How do you recruit, identify potential recruits into it? And then talk a little bit about, for example, do women receive equal pay? Or is there discrimination sort of on the across the security forces in terms of pay? You've talked about some of the other issues, but I'm basically curious as to who's in charge and how they go about bringing female recruits into the security forces. When we visited a couple of years ago, we actually visited and met some pilots, young women pilots who'd been recruited and were being trained to fly helicopters, and we're very excited to be doing so. But I'm just curious as to who's in charge and how much control we have over that process.
In terms of who's in charge, the Afghan security forces, both the Army and the police, have stood up recruitment commands over the last 3 years. They didn't have those before. They're in charge, so the Afghans are in charge of recruitment. We've provided training, advice, and assistance, and so we have advisors within those recruitment commands. The targets and goals that have been set for recruitment of women at the enlisted and officer levels are set at the ministerial level, and the recruitment command's task is to implement those. And so they do go out and have efforts to affirmatively recruit women. However, those recruits, as I said in my statement, those goals are not being met right now. It is very hard right now to get to recruit women into the Afghan forces, and our advisors who work with the Afghans who are doing that say that the biggest obstacle is family pressures. That said, I think there are a number of efforts underway to try and increase the pool that is considered for among Afghan women. And what I understand anecdotally, and will certainly ask when you are on your trip, if people who are really fully up to date on this can do that, younger Afghan women are showing a greater and greater interest in joining both the Army and the police as they have come up through the educational system over the last 12 years. But I hope that's a good enough answer. If it's not, we can get some more information for you. But it's the Afghans who are in charge.
Equality of pay.
Equality of pay. Yes, pay in the Afghan military is based upon your rank and position. There is not separate pay scale. There are not separate pay scales for men and women in the Afghan Army.
And the turnover rate. Do you have any sense if there's?
I do not. We'll get back to you on the turnover, on the attrition rate of females versus males.
Well, you would think if that many women have had access, greater numbers of women have had access to education, and we've been there long enough actually to see people from the earliest of years into graduating, that you're right, it reinforces the notion that there would be a bigger pool of potential candidates who have an interest. I'm curious, I'm also curious, as we've drawn down our end strength and we've transitioned portions of the country to control of the Afghan National Security Forces, how we're monitoring the impact on women and girls so that we're able to compare before and after and maybe get engaged when we see alarming things taking place.
Well, both our continuing advise and assist force and on the intelligence side, we monitor the full range of goals that we have for Afghan security forces, including both the performance of women in the security forces and their treatment of women. However, it should not come as any surprise, as we have fewer forces, our ability to do that monitoring is degraded. So we are working with our colleagues in the intelligence community to try and come up with ways so that we can maintain a higher level of awareness as we have fewer people and fewer organizations to do that monitoring. So that is a challenge, one that we will identify in the next iteration of our 1230 report to the Congress. We're not giving up on it, though. We have a program to try and address it, but we don't have all the answers on that monitoring issue yet.
I think it would be important to make sure that there's not a big drop in the numbers of young girls going to school that access to health care facilities does not dramatically change, that all the access to employment opportunities. We've met with women who are across a broad range of opportunities become engaged in bringing income into their household. So it would not simply be about what's happening within the security forces, but for us to have a strong sense of really how well those security forces are working. It's really about how women continue to be integrated into a broad range of society in Afghanistan. And are there such metrics in place? Are we monitoring that at all?
Yes, we are monitoring what's happening with respect to women and the Afghan population as a whole, and in terms of issues of education, health, and access to employment. We will continue to be reporting on that in the 1230 report, which Congress has mandated we do. But again, the adequacy of our collection efforts as we withdraw our forces and have less resources is a challenge.
Is there a way we can ask the Afghan National Security Forces to monitor this so that they can respond?
We do. That's a big part. That's a big part of how we're doing that. But we have to then validate that what they're collecting actually is accurate, because and that's a big part of the challenge. How do you monitor that what they report is accurate?
Thank you. To the end, I just want to thank you for creating the opportunity for this hearing, because I think it's so important, and we've appreciated very much your testimony. I sort of have a laundry list of issues. One is I do think the recruitment and retention issue is very important, and as Congresswoman Davis said, there was a fund set aside to help encourage that. I'm sorry that Mr. Sedney has left us, because he suggested that it's an either-or. In reality, I think it's a both-and. And you can't cut out the funding to recruit women and expect that you're going to have a better luck at the long-term security of the country. It is not an either-or. That is just a comment. And I appreciate also Congresswoman Spears' all of our concerns, really, as to what is going to happen, and that at the very least we should look for broader asylum opportunities for women, Afghan women. But the great reality is that there are many, many women in the country who will never know, never have the opportunity, never have the resources, never be able to take advantage of it. So we have to remain, I think, very mindful of that, as I know we all do. I've always been struck when we've been there, that there's a very engaged community of women, very, very polished, very educated, taking great advantage of the opportunities that have developed. But then that is not the great bulk of women in Afghanistan. And yet we've met some remarkable women, very impoverished, who've taken taken advantage of the micro-lending, for example, to have modest businesses. And I did happen to see a program on PBS talking about, in Pakistan, similar efforts where you have micro-lending that women take advantage of. They have these small businesses that bring resources into the family. It cuts down on domestic violence because the pressures on the family unit are relieved by women being able to be part of supporting a family. So I think we've seen some of the positive outcomes through our investments there. I wanted to ask you a question, though, and that is, as we proceed to drawing down and seek through a peace process, perhaps, that I echoed your comments about women's rights are not a tradable good. And I want to know what you would see as the alarm bells, where you would see if women are not at the table as part of the process, if you don't see people standing up strongly enough for some of the gains. What would you see as real alarm bells, and what should we in Congress and the international community do to push back on that? And I ask that of both of you.
I'll take a first crack at it. The real alarm bells for me, it goes back to the number of incidents being reported. Now, a dip in reported incidents doesn't mean that it's not happening. It just means that there are fewer reports. And so peeling that back a little bit, making sure that cases that are coming forward are being prosecuted, and if all of a sudden a great percentage of the cases or the complaints are being dropped, whether through coercion or incompetence or actual malice on the behalf of the court system or the prosecution, I think is worth watching. the number of women on the streets walking around, feeling safe enough to walk around outside of their home, it's not significant now, but if it goes down, I think that's a good indicator of a greater loss of freedom. I think another key indicator for me would be not hearing the women's voices. When codels stop, what happens? There will be vastly fewer codels after 2014. And so who are those women going to talk to? Who will they get support from? And so I think there need to be a couple of forums that are more enduring and aren't necessarily tied to, Mrs. Davis is visiting, or Representative Roby is visiting, or Representative Tsongas is visiting, to make sure that something is a little bit more enduring, because I think not hearing the voices is the #1 indicator for me.
I agree with others who say that increasingly I think it's going to be harder to have the data across the country to know what's going on, and therefore the warnings are going to be harder to detect. Having said that, I think there are organizations, National Solidarity Program is one, Human Rights Commission is another, which are collecting data, so we can continue to pay attention to them and watch the trends very, very closely. In terms of what kind of responses that Congress might take to protect them, especially as some of these warning bells appear, I think actually continued support to some of these programs that will continue to be able to operate across the country will be important. I think second, thinking in terms of scenarios ahead of time. I think that we could imagine 3 or 4 very different outcomes post-14, and being prepared to think through what kind of responses we might be prepared to put into place. I think perhaps reframing our language so it's not talk of leaving, but it's a talk of a different type of commitment to the country as reflected in the strategic partnership agreement that's already been signed, because there will be continue to be some form of commitment. And I think if Afghans hear the language of leaving, it heightens concerns even more than might be warranted. And then I think it is continuing. I mean, in South Korea, in Germany, troops have been kept for many, many decades. Is there a case for continued commitment, including some form of troop presence, not in a combat role and not in a way that is vulnerable to the loss of life in the future, but some form of commitment?